triste. Alors, Sylvain, you know that Sylvain has served in the Canadian Armed Force. He spent 30 years in service to Queen and country, and two of his uncles served in World War II. Paul Henry in the Royal 22e Regiment, and Antonio in the Service Corps. Antonio did not come back and is now wrestling in Normandy. Sylvain has served in several tours with NATO and UN. He served in Iran, Iraq, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, but nothing can compare to what the people of the first and second hardly experienced. To help us understand what these people saw and lived, Sylvain will read part of a memoir of a veteran from First World War, Mr. George Gould. Je te laisse la suite, Sylvain. Accueillons de ce pas chaleureusement Sylvain Auffret dans un discours intitulé Veteran Remembers, Sylvain Auffret. C'est en mode muet, Sylvain.
Some people would say it's good to hear me speechless. So just to put you in situation, what I'm about to read is part of a journal of a soldier from the First World War, as Ghislaine mentioned. And it's something that will be sharing just after the end of the war. So Mr. Gould was 96 years old when he shared the story you're about to hear. And in 1917, Georges Gould worked in Saint-Jean on the government boat. The conservative government at the time had just passed the conscription law. And as he knew he was going to be conscripted anyways, he decided to volunteer for the war. So here is a story from Monsieur Gould. It's hard to believe. 2 years ago, I crossed the Atlantic by boat to disembark in Boulogne, France, in the spring of 1917. We had just trained just a little before we were sent to war, only 2 months of training in Saint-Jean. My cousin and I, Tom, were part of the 65th Infantry Regiment. When I arrived in France, I was transferred to the 26th Infantry Regiment, which had pretty much been decimated in the previous battle. I was lucky enough to see my cousin once before the end of the war. It was while going to the front, I recognized him among a group of soldiers along the way. We hugged each other before we parted again. We both made it through this hill, but Tom came back to Canada, one shoulder less. I remember my first contact with the war as if it was yesterday. We had walked all afternoon and all night to get to the trenches. We could hear the gunshots in the distance. In the evening, we saw the bombs explode in the sky, as if the sky was in fire. I'm going to be there tomorrow night, I remember thinking. It wasn't long before I started seeing dead people everywhere. As I arrived to the trenches, a bomb exploded and a shrapnel split the one walking in front of me in two. We continued to walk, stepping over his body, as if nothing had happened. It got to me. For over a year, I lived in the trenches fighting the war. Every day, all I see is destruction and death. 6 days a week, we stayed in the front lines. We slept in the mud with rats. On Sunday, we were sent back to the rear to rest. On Sundays, those were the good days. We were not constantly under fire by the enemy, even if bombs fell next to us from time to time, and we could remove our webbing, our combat gear, to kill the fleas. It's hard to believe that the fear of the first days was gone, that after time, you get used to all that. It's just that I see so many things, so many death. You become hardened. You don't worry about what will happen next. I could never share all the horrors I saw when I was in the front lines. After battles, we could sometimes find a Canadian and a German dead next to one another. They had each planted their bayonets in each other and stayed there, lying next to each other with their bayonets still sticking out of their body. I remember when I found Charlie Castonguay after a battle. His eyes were fixed on a dead man who had his right leg passed right through his body, the whole top of his head torn off, and he was looking at him, eyes wide open. Charlie never recovered from that horror of war. The doctor sent Charlie home because he was in a state of shell shock. Charlie never spoke again afterwards. It was at the Battle of Cambrai that I was injured. We attacked the town of Cambrai and succeeded in capturing it by taking a large number of German prisoners. We continued to push the German lines. I was part of a 7-man patrol in charge of a machine gun. I was firing the machine gun. It was an open field that the Germans who were positioned further out in the field fired their machine gun at us. The 6 men who were with me were killed. I was shot in the hip, which came through my kidneys. I managed to roll myself into a hole and stayed there from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. The Canadian troops later that day on an attack picked me up on the way and took me to a hospital. The doctor sent me to England, and here I am. They just told me the war is over. I do not see why it is that we have war. The Germans are people just like you and I. When I think about it, it gives me a headache. Sometimes I wonder why so many others were killed, but I managed to get through it. It makes me wonder. Fellow Toastmasters, yes, I've been on tours, as Ghislaine mentioned. I've seen some pretty bad things, and I too wonder why it is that myself or people like Chris, who also saw many things, come back. Some would argue maybe not normal, but relatively normal. But nothing that we saw compares to what some of these people lived over there. Next week is Remembrance Day. It is not a day to celebrate war, but it is a day to celebrate, is the wrong word, but to commemorate, remember those who passed away over there. I was fortunate enough to be in Normandy on the 50th anniversary, and I saw the grave of my uncle who did not come back. Never met him. Was not even a twinkle in my mom's eye when that battle took place. But I remember being, just as I am right now, moved at seeing his tombstone. So next week, please take a moment. We're not going in person at Remembrance Day due to COVID, but I encourage you at 11 o'clock to take a moment, not to celebrate war, but to remember. Regardless of being Canadian, German, Chinese, Japanese, I don't care. All these people fought for what they believed was their country, the right to what they believed. May they rest in peace. Madam Chair.